It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a cross-country road trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it's very long and very barren. Sometimes we'd go hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass through didn't consist of much more than a rusty old gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert again and again and again. I started getting a headache, and my husband suggested that I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colours of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up, and the first thing I noticed was how dark it was. I believe it was around 10 PM. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop, and he told me that he was going to grab some food for us and asked if I needed to pee. Knowing that I might not have another chance for quite a while, I went into the shop to use the restroom. Both the women's and men's restrooms were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy and tired and realized how badly I needed to pee, so I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way the short distance from the door to the nearest of the two stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of the only other stall. She didn't quite look homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild grey hair, almost shoulder length if it hadn't been sticking out every direction from her head. It looks like it hadn't seen a brush in weeks. She was wearing ragged looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitting black workout shorts, and I remember noting her foam flip-flops, several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this is Texas in July. The jacket was just hanging on her shoulders crooked, like she hadn't bothered to take a few seconds to just put it on correctly. She was carrying something in a tied up plastic grocery bag. I gave a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me in return. Then, her face turned wild and intense looking. Her eyebrows were set as if she was angry, but her eyes had a wild, alive look. She looked at me like she was hungry, and this was when I felt the first tinge of something wrong. I tried to brush it off. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body more angled towards me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched as if she was ready to act. Her hands were not up by her face or trying to fix her mess of a hair or even being washed. They were just at her sides, elbows also slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the stall door and took my time using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I left the safety of the stall. I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there, so I waited longer. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I heard it open and then slam closed, and the door was pretty heavy and had slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me before I reached for the lock, then paused, fingers only an inch from the lock. I stayed as silently as I could manage to confirm what I had just thought I heard. Yes, breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave. At this point I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking she left only to stick around and be as quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time it must have been at least 20 minutes, but I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction in which her breathing was coming from that she had positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her feet. Finally, I heard her leave. This time, I waited a few minutes to make sure that she hadn't tried her trick again. I slipped out of the stall, quickly washed my hands and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside and I had no idea where she was. She couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store and quietly slipped out the door behind him. Sure enough, crouched right outside the front door is the woman. She seemed surprised as she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the side of the door. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was okay since I had taken so much longer than usual, and I said that I would tell him all about it once we were away from that store. So that was it. I have no idea what her intentions were, but I hope I never see her again. I grew up in a very safe, very affluent neighborhood. It was unheard of for anyone to lock their cars or houses, and when someone new moved into the neighborhood, it was mere moments before they were welcomed with open arms and open doors. Despite being surrounded by what could be described as one large neighborhood family, my mum was very particular about house rules being followed, one of which was never go out alone. Walking to a friend's house, 3 of us had to go, so 2 could walk home together after dropping you off. It was rare, but occasionally just 2 of us would be able to sneak out from under her watchful eye and run to the corner store a few blocks down for some candy or soda. One sweltering day during the summer, I turned 9. I found myself home alone and restless. I decided to take my sister's cool new 10-speed for a spin around the block a few times. Now, even though I was very tall for my age, the bike was still a few inches too big for me. I decided that didn't matter, jumped on, and started pedaling. My first lap around the neighborhood went off without a hitch. Birds were chirping, sun was shining, and the wind blowing through my curled hair felt wonderful. Second lap around the block, I passed an older, unfamiliar car parked on the side of the road, and the sun reflecting off the huge scrape down the side temporarily shocked my vision into bright blue stripes which I furiously tried to blink away. The third lap, I saw the car pull off the side of the road, heading towards me, and a tiny bit of unease began to grow in my stomach as the driver slowed when he passed me. I chalked it up to being scared of getting caught out alone and continued on my way. I picked up speed as I rounded the corner towards my house and decided to go for one more time around the block, but to make it quick so I'd beat my mum home and avoid the trouble I knew that I'd be in if she caught me out alone. I hit the bottom of the hill next to our house with some speed and started to climb on the top, slowing more and more and closer I got. By the time I reached the top of the hill, I had to stop and catch my breath, teetering the too tall bike at my hip. As I struggled to catch my breath, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, my arms locked on the handlebars, and every inch of my body froze. I had been caught. I just knew it. I heard a car creeping up behind me, and it just had to be my mum. But it wasn't. When relief should have washed over me, the unknown dread only deepened further, stiffening my frozen still limbs. I turned to see the same old car with the same blinding scratch down the side, slowing down right next to me. The man stopped the car right next to my bike on the wrong side of the street, and through his opening driver door started to ask me if I had seen a stray dog running about, because his had come off the leash and ran off. I froze. This cliche question is the one they warned us about in school, the one every kidnapper supposedly used. I decided if I answered him firmly and rode my bike away, that he would know his plan wouldn't work on me. Plus, he might just really be looking for his dog. This was my plan. My terrified body betrayed that plan, and a trembling "no" is all I could manage. As I fumbled my feet to the pedals of this too big bike, his car door flew open and he lunged. "No!" I said again as I wobbled my way past his open car door, his hand brushing the back of my shirt and knocking my back tire as I pedaled as fast as I could the 50 feet to the next driveway that I saw. I pedaled, legs burning, up the drive, running my tire so hard into my neighbor's front step that it bent the wheel. My body catapulted over the handlebars and I burst through my neighbor's front door. "Eddie! Eddie! Eddie! Eddie, help!" My neighbor was not home. I ran into the kitchen, still calling in hopes that I was wrong. "Eddie!"
"What are you doing?"
a man's voice behind me said, and I froze. Hearing my heartbeat in my ears, feeling the blood pumping through my veins, knowing that this was it. I slowly turned around, not knowing what else to do. And there stood my neighbor's son, home from college. I dissolved into tears, gulping out what happened. He tossed the bent bike into the back of his truck and drove me around the corner to the safety of my home. My mum was home and had the look of death in her eyes until she saw my tear-streaked face. The police were called, the neighbors were called. The car had been spotted frantically circling the block the few minutes following our encounter, but he was gone by the time the police arrived. To this day, 20 years later, I still have a hard time riding my bike alone, and I still get chills when cars slow down next to me. I still wonder if the next girl was as lucky as I was. This takes place last spring, almost exactly 1 year ago. At the time, my parents and I lived in a somewhat solitary life out in the countryside. Other than bad cell phone and internet reception, there were other homes in the area, but not many, and exclusively consisted of retirees and wealthy families. My parents, who are wealthy and retired, were planning a trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to sightsee and visit my mum's ill mother. I've been to Gettysburg before on a class field trip and decided not to go. I had schoolwork and projects to work on that were due that Friday, and going to Gettysburg for a second time didn't seem all that interesting to me. My parents do a lot of traveling and volunteer work, and over the years placed a lot of trust in me, so they had no issues with me being alone for several days, or even a week at a time by the time I reached 16 years old and obtained my driver's license. So anyway, I got up the morning of their departure, and by the time I left for school, my parents were preparing to leave. When I got home that afternoon, they were already gone. I had 3 days alone. I spent the first afternoon and evening doing homework and gaming. That evening, I decided to drive out to the closest town and pick up a pizza for myself, since I didn't feel like preparing anything. When I got home, I ate about half of the pizza, and after watching some YouTube, decided to turn in for the night. I woke up sometime around midnight, which isn't out of the ordinary for me as I sometimes have trouble sleeping at night, and I went downstairs for a glass of orange juice and decided to flip through the channels on our living room television. I was sitting there, looking at my phone more than watching the television, when I saw a light turn on through one of the living room windows. It was our garage's motion sensor light. Did my parents come home much earlier than expected? I sat quietly and waited. The light eventually turned off and I didn't hear any noises. It must have been an animal or something. Perhaps a deer. I turned off the television and went upstairs and into my bedroom and lied in my bed. I fell asleep not too long afterwards. I woke up to the sound of my alarm. Time to get ready for school. Oh, joy. I arose, got ready, and headed out to the door into my car and drove off to school. I got home that afternoon and spent the day similarly to before. Did homework, gamed, ate dinner, and went to bed. I slept through the night that night and woke the next day and headed off to school. My mum called me during school and left a message saying that her and my dad are going to stay longer than expected, as my grandmother was in some pretty rough shape. I got home and once again the day went as it did the last two, except this time I finished up my senior project and was almost officially finished with high school. About damn time, I say. I relaxed that evening outside on our hammock and read a book until sunset, debating whether or not to travel to Gettysburg the next day to visit my grandmother. Dinner time came and went, and I decided to settle on the couch and continue reading my book. Since it was Friday, I had no school the next day and stayed up longer than usual. It was about 11 o'clock at night when I looked at my phone and noted the time. I decided to go upstairs and game for a couple of hours. I left my bedroom and across our foyer to use the bathroom sometime that night, when I noticed through one of our front door windows that the garage light was on again. That's odd. I peered outside towards the light and saw my car, but nothing else. The light turned off and I went to use the bathroom. I decided to grab a snack afterwards, so went into my kitchen after using the bathroom and made a sandwich. Out of nowhere, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from one of our morning room windows. I felt on edge as I looked towards the tapping and saw nothing but blinds over the windows. Having never dealt with something like this before, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't have been hearing things. Could I? I definitely didn't imagine the motion sensor light being on. I wanted to call my mum, but they were almost likely sleeping by now. I waited and listened in to see if I could hear anything else. Nothing. I went upstairs into my parents' bedroom and found my dad's handgun in his dresser drawer. I sat in my bedroom and looked out my window towards the backyard. I watched for what felt like 10 minutes or so, hoping that whoever or whatever it was would go away. I eventually went back downstairs and, to my horror, heard the tapping noise again. Except now, it was coming from one of the front door windows. The garage sensor light was on, but when I looked towards the window, I saw nobody. Perhaps a friend of mine was playing a prank on me. I have a couple of good friends who know that I'm home alone, but they've never done anything like this before. I texted all of them and got only one reply. Remember that friend I mentioned at the beginning of my post? That's the friend. He denied being at my house and told me that he was lying in bed trying to fall asleep. I waited and waited until I could hear another noise. But about half an hour went by without further incident. I didn't see the garage light come on again, nor did I hear any other noises for the rest of the night. I turned in for the night after checking the locks on our doors and windows. I woke up the next morning and went downstairs to have breakfast. Afterwards, I vividly remembered the previous night's events and went outside to look around the house to see if anything was out of place or peculiar. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. Our patio was left untouched. None of our stuff had been moved or taken, and our shed hadn't been tampered with. Even our shed, which was unlocked, didn't seem to be messed with. I looked inside of it and didn't notice anything missing that I had seen the week prior while assisting my dad with yard work. I went back inside and decided to sleep for a while longer. I woke up that afternoon around 2:30 p.m. I called my mum and told her about what happened last night, and she told me to keep my dad's gun with me and, if necessary, to call the police if I saw anyone or heard the tapping again. She also told me that they would be home the next evening. I went on a drive later on that afternoon and stopped by my friend's house for a while before heading home. I came home later than expected and went inside, plopping myself down on the couch and watched YouTube on my phone until nightfall. After eating dinner, I sat back on the couch and watched more YouTube. I was dozing off on the couch when I heard the sound of someone walking on our patio. Uh-oh. I swiftly made my way towards the back door and waited, listening for any noises. I then had an idea. I quietly ran towards the front door and peered towards the garage to see if this person would walk towards it and turn the motion sensor light on. Then I can see if I know the person if I could see their face. Luckily, exactly that happened. I was looking towards the garage when the light came on. I saw the person light up in the night. It wasn't anybody that I recognized. At first, I couldn't tell if it was a male or a female, given their long hair that covered half of their face, and their attire wasn't noticeably masculine or feminine in appearance. What I could tell, though, was that this person was armed and was carrying a dagger. Jesus Christ, I had to call the police now. I may have a gun, but I'm way too afraid to confront this creepy looking person on my own, especially since I was probably not going to have the guts to actually shoot him or her if they attacked me or tried to get inside. Suddenly, we made eye contact. I felt my heart drop. I saw a smirk form across the person's face as they walked towards the front door towards me. I jumped up and ran away towards the kitchen and called 911. After being redirected to the state police barracks, I told the dispatcher that an armed man or woman with some sort of a dagger was creeping around my house. I stayed on the phone with them as I heard the person tapping on the front door, presumably with their weapon. I couldn't tell you what I felt at this point. Unfortunately, the closest officer was about a half an hour away from me, so I had to fend for myself until then. I tried my best to describe the person to the dispatcher, but I simply couldn't. I told her about the motion light coming on the first night, the tapping noises and the sound of someone walking on my patio. She then asked if he or she tried to force entry, but I said no, which was equally as baffling between the two of us. I jumped when I suddenly heard the tapping coming from behind me. I heard a deep, muffled laugh coming from outside. At least now I knew it was a man. Holy fuck. I looked at my phone after not hearing the dispatcher for a few moments, only to notice that the call had dropped. Why now? Damn reception out here in the middle of nowhere. I felt genuinely afraid as fuck at this point, so I ran up to the upper part of my foyer and lied down on the carpet and focused my attention on both halves of my house, the front door and back door, gun in my hand, phone in the other. I didn't have to recall the barracks, given the dispatcher had already called me back by the time I settled down on the ground in the foyer. My phone signal was weak, so I wasn't sure how much longer I would be able to stay on the line. As I waited, I heard the occasional tapping noise on my windows and doors. I then heard for the first time the sound of my back door being tapped. I talked to the dispatcher, who was doing her best job to keep me calm as I sat there like a scared little mouse hiding from a cat. I felt scared as a motherfucker, even with a gun in my hand. After about 15 minutes and losing connection with the dispatcher again, the occasional sounds ceased. I went into the master bedroom and looked out the window towards the road. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity when I finally saw a car driving up towards my house. Finally. I ran downstairs and waited near the front door and watched as a squad car came into my driveway. As I watched, two cops came out, one coming up to the door as the other walked around the house. I opened the door and greeted the female officer who came inside. We stood there in my foyer as I explained the previous night's events leading up to tonight, and then finally tonight. I also gave my description of the person. She made notes about everything while the male officer was walking around my house. After a few more questions, she told me that they'll drive around the area a couple of times and recommended that my parents install a security system when they return from their trip. This is my father's story. As a child, my father was a paperboy, and he would get up very early in the morning to deliver them. My father would always end up with a few extra papers, so at the end of his route, he would offer papers to other early birds leaving for work and whatnot. On this day, my father offered a man who was sitting in a parked van. The man just stared at my dad and didn't respond, so my dad just went on his way. As my dad was walking away, he heard a car door open and the sound of feet hitting the pavement. He turned around and saw the man running after him. My dad was very athletic in his day. He played basketball and baseball, so he took off running. The man chased him for a bit, but my dad knew the neighborhood like the back of his hand and cut through backyards and hopped fences. He eventually lost the man and got home safely. He didn't tell his parents because he figured that they would make him quit. A few weeks passed by and two local boys went missing and their bodies were found at a campground. They were raped and then shot in the head. The man who committed the awful crimes was William J. Wright. When my father saw him in the newspapers, he recognized him as the man who chased him. This happened a few days ago, and I'm still pretty shaken up about it. I only just thought to post it here, so here it goes. On Friday afternoon, I got a call from my friend named Sarah asking if I wanted to meet her and another friend named Lisa at a Dunkin' Donuts, as we hadn't seen one another in a while. Dunkin' Donuts is a 15-minute walk from my house, so I decided I would walk. Besides, the weather was fine. I got to Dunkin' Donuts and found where Sarah and Lisa were sat, so I went to join them. As we were chatting, I noticed that my sister, Elena, was sat at a table in the corner of the room with her friend, Jess. For some context, my sister and her friend are both 18 years old. My sister still lives with my parents, whereas I live alone. I excused myself from the table and went over to Elena and Jess's table. They were sat at a table with 3 seats, so I went to sit down and said, "Hey." They both jumped a little, but then they looked more relieved than anything to see me. Immediately, Elena whispered to me, "Don't look now, but the guy in the blue shirt, I think he's been following Jess and I." I glanced over and I saw the middle-aged man sat at a table facing away from us. "He's passed our table a good 5 times in the past 20 minutes to go to the bathroom, but he walks slower as he passes us," she continued. I told him that they were most likely being paranoid and that there was nothing to worry about. But for their peace of mind, I offered to leave with them so they wouldn't feel as worried. I walked back over to my table and explained the situation to Sarah and Lisa. Both of them laughed it off and assumed my sister to be paranoid. Literally about a minute later, I saw the man get up from his seat and walk towards the bathroom. My eyes followed him, and sure enough, he walked extremely slow past Elena and Jess. In fact, it was almost comical how obviously slow he became. Both Elena and Jess looked in my direction, and I nodded to show that I had seen him walk slower. About 5 minutes later, I went into the toilets. On my way, I passed Elena and Jess and told them that I was ready to leave whenever they were. They both agreed that they were ready to leave now. I told them that I was going to the bathroom and that we could leave after I had done my business. Elena had come in her car, so she was going to give me a lift back. I went into the toilet stall, did my business, and washed my hands. I asked them what's up, and they explained that another man had joined the strange creeper man, and that the men were both pointing and staring at them, so they rightfully felt unsafe. We walked back into the eating area. I put my money on our table and explained to Lisa and Sarah that I was taking off, and I would explain what was going on when I got home. We all got into Elena's car and left the creeps in the car's rearview mirror. After a 2-minute drive, we reached my house. Just then, I remembered that I had been meaning to return something that I had borrowed from my mother, so I asked if Elena could drive me to my parents' house, as she was going there anyway. I jumped out the cars to get what I needed when my phone rang. It was Elena. She explained that a car had driven past and had pulled into a driveway. She said the driver of the vehicle was the creep from Dunkin' Donuts. I looked out of my window and sure enough, there was a car which didn't belong to the owner of the house parked on their driveway. I got the girls into my house and locked the door. I instructed Elena to take a photo of the car and its license plate, and I told Jess to call 911, as she gave the operator more information than I could. Elena took the photos, and we sort of gathered around Jess as she was speaking to the operator. She had finished telling the story, and I heard the operator assure us that the police would be at my house soon. A few minutes passed, and there was a loud knock at the front door, followed by a loud voice shouting,
"It's the police."
We all did a sigh of relief as I went to open the door. Jess told the operator that the police were here, and she hung up. I was in the process of unlocking the door when I thought to look through the peephole at the top of the door. I peered through, and it wasn't a police officer. It was the same guy. I froze in fear, and I didn't know what to say. "We didn't call the police," I managed to shout back to the man through the door. Elena and Jess were both confused as to why I said this.
"We had a call, sir,"
the man shouted back. "You have the wrong address," I yelled back and informed the girls that it was the creep at the door and not a police officer. Both were rightfully shocked and extremely scared, as I was. I was about to tell Jess to call the police again until I heard the sirens.
Sir, you have to let me in.
The man shouted again. This time I didn't answer. He was pounding on the door. His commands for me to let him in turned into begging and pleading. I heard the police car pull up and some commotion outside. An actual police officer knocked on the door and I let him in. I checked the peephole first. The police officers took the man into custody while another police officer took Elena and Jess into the dining room for some brief questioning. I called my parents and Jess called hers. Both were extremely quickly once we told them what happened. The man was found with a kitchen knife on him and some other weapons in his car. Who knows what could have happened if I hadn't looked through the peephole first.